Thanks everyone for joining today. We've just turned 11 o'clock, so we'll just give it 30 or 40 seconds for the attendees to join. Thanks ever so much for finding the time. So brilliant. Good to see so many people joining already. Thanks for joining. My name is Russell Edwards, Account Director here at Aptem, and I'll be hosting today's session. We do have our usual housekeeping to quickly run through first, so I'm just going to go through that. So we're going to be recording the session. We'll share it via email. Feel free to share it with your colleagues. You will be muted for the duration of the session. So if you do need any kind of technical assistance during the webinar, please use the chat function in the right-hand panel. And also for any kind of questions, there will be an opportunity to ask those at the end of the session. And again, put your questions in the right-hand panel under questions. So that should be all relatively self-explanatory. And just as I suppose, somewhat of a forward to this morning's session, I guess with mainstream access now to AI tools being relatively new, it's it's no surprise that organisations can and are struggling to form, I guess, a strategic approach to AI adoption. So we've decided to run this session today in response to such conversations with many of our own customers, and hope to offer some insights and food for thought from our guest speaker who has worked in the AI field for nearly 20 years. It's worth pointing out that apprenticeship providers are in quite a unique position. You know, you're touched by the potential impact of AI, I guess, in multiple ways. So, I guess, firstly, there's the impact of AI on your products and services. That's to say, the way you approach content creation, how you teach and coach, how your apprentices learn, and how they're assessed. But also, of course, you'll touch more broadly by the impact of AI on the job market and the type of training programs that your employer partners want to spend their levy on. And we can see that coming down the track already. And of course, with your own organizations, you'll be looking at the approach you take to safely adopting new technology to improve behind the scenes operational efficiencies. So, with all of that in mind, I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Aitchison, founder of the consultancy firm AI for You. And I guess, unlike the majority of us on the webinar today, me included, AI is not a new concept for Rob. He started his AI journey 2 decades ago, where he was involved in some of the first machine learning models for driverless cars. For 7 years, he has been a member of the Artificial Intelligence All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Citizen Impact Committee, where he explores an interest in machine ethics, bias, and how AI will transform employment. So, Rob is a consultant to both established companies and startups around their strategic and safe application of AI. And we've invited Rob to join us today to offer you his perspective on the impact of AI on the world of work and skills, and what organisations need to consider when planning their next steps in AI adoption. The format today will be a presentation from Rob, and then we'll go to some Q&A. So do get your questions in via the chat function. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Russell. I hope you enjoyed today's 40 or 50 minutes. My introduction was excellent. As we were talking before, I've been in this kind of world for quite some time. The title of the talk is kind of from why to how. And one of the things I think that's really important with AI is any other transitional and major transformational technology is to step back and decide why you're doing anything with it. It's not a case of just rushing in, although many people did rush in. In fact, I certainly did rush in when I started using the new LLM tools. But there is a big question: is why you're doing anything, why you're trying to achieve. So we're going to cover a lot of the why first before we get to the how. You know, how do you do things? And I'll be looking a little bit at leadership and other frameworks for implementation. Anyway, just a little bit more about me. I started off my journey in communication research with BT. Spent a long time in management with a Fortune 100 US company working across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. My journey with AI started, as Russell was saying, about 20 years ago. The first thing I worked on was machine learning for cars, so driverless cars. So well before Tesla and everyone else, we were looking at how you stop running people over, how you identify things using LiDAR. And so it's not a new technology. Interestingly enough, the principles of that are still in play today. Um, and as Russell was saying, I've been attending the APPGs for about 8 years. By the way, these things are not exclusive. You don't need a badge or a name or anything to get into them. They're open to everybody, and you can join and you can learn more of these things. In fact, I was at one last night, which is quite interesting because they called an election at the same time. But never mind. Anyway, let's get on. I'd like to run a poll now so we can get some feedback and what you think about the technology. And there's some questions that you should be able to see now that I'd like to get an answer to before I push on. So if you can think about those simple questions and yeah, hopefully I can get some perspective in your thinking at the minute.
So we've just got those answers coming through, Rob. We'll just give it 10 or 15 seconds.
Okay.
Still got some answers coming in. Okay, so I think broadly speaking, Rob, the near 50% as it stands right now is we've adopted AI in some areas but lack strategic direction. And then second to that, at around 30%, is we don't use AI, waiting for clarity around the issues. And then just a smidge over 20%, AI is a useful tool, but we only use it internally. And then the one that's at zero, I guess the outlier is that we have a solid strategy and have widely adopted AI.
Okay.
So I think probably speaking to that is that half the audience have adopted AI but lack that strategic direction, and then those other two are kind of like between 20 and 30% useful tool used internally, don't use
Mhm.
AI, waiting for clarity.
Hmm. Yeah, those are quite interesting, and I think you find that quite widely, with about 50% having some level of adoption in some way. Something, yeah. I'll go back over those stats and where people are at. I think it's interesting. 30% have got no AI. Maybe that's an internal thing, and 20% say useful but internally. Um, so it's useful to look at where people are going, but everyone I think is touching it. I think that's clear from the poll. So what about building a framework for success? So I was actually at an LSIP event a couple of weeks back, and I had a bit of discussion with with one of the council people there, and they were saying, "Oh, people have to learn AI." Well, that's not really the case. It's not really about learning AI. It's really about the tools and the frameworks that are available. I mean, I'm not a machine learning engineer by any stretch of the imagination. I understand how the technology works, and I did work in the technical end 10, 15 years ago. But the actual process that we're talking about are really we're discussing about the tools around AI. So there are people obviously within companies like Aptem that are machine learning engineers, and they go and they build things and they test them and they do stuff. But we're really talking about the implementation of AI tools within programs. What are the strategies for success? By the way, we're not really even at the end of the beginning, but we are very much getting to the point that the AI models are reaching a degree of maturity. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the answers to the questions that you raise shouldn't be done in isolation. That's really important. It's very important to find out what has been doing externally. And the reason for that is when you begin to adopt AI and you then begin to expose what you're doing to the outside world, you then hit a number of factors, things that the legal side, things that how things are done technically in other teams, also how secure things like your data are. And the answers that you find are really going to be driven by other factors other than technology. They're actually your attitude to ethics, the law, and governance. And by the way, I'll be very honest, the smaller the organization, often the less ethics there are around some of the areas of adoption. And this has resulted in some lawsuits at the minute because of the way things have been trained. So it's very important to decide where you're going to be stepping in this journey. It depends on your structure as well, and your openness and your process for delivering change. So there's a line, you've maybe seen it before, AI won't replace you, but someone using it possibly will. So anyway, the agenda, get on with things. So I want to start off with some data. So because LLMs in particular, what we're talking about, have been around for at least a couple of years, there's quite a lot of good data now that has been gathered on what is being done and the attitude within employers in particular to the technology and how they're going to adopt it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the art itself, very briefly on the technical side, and then the UK government perspective. They've recently published some updates by Ofsted and Ofqual, and they've actually done another document. It only came out this week around a thing called the AI Authority, and that's a new perspective that's coming to light and may be driven before the election. I'm not sure. And then I'll talk a little bit about the culture in AI, because I think it's important to really discuss how you're going to adopt this technology and where it's going to fit within your company and then in the outside world. And then I'll talk a little bit about the career pathways and conclude with where we've been in this journey. So this data, one of the first reviews I looked at was a survey that came out, again, fairly recently, March 24, from Mercer, you may or may not know. And they had a very big survey globally around executives and leaders within almost 12,000 individuals and over 800 companies. So it was really big. And what they found was that 80% of the jobs within those organizations, from SMEs to large multinationals, are going to be affected by generative AI. And importantly, nearly all the jobs will see their core tasks change significantly. So it's a very big change. What is interesting is that the redesigning work and corporate AI was not the highest thing in the execs list. However, it was the one that they believe would deliver the most business growth. The key thing they felt was enhancing the employee experience. And that's very important, as you've seen these surveys, because the employee experience that everyone finds can be actually enhanced very much by working with AI and not just something to be feared, if you like. So why are they doing it? Well, they're looking at this side, taking away transactional work and replacing it with relational, human-centered work. So AI, again, and AI tools are not about learning necessarily how AI works. It's actually about how the different tool sets fit with the actual role of the job. So they're looking at this 2027, where expertise and relational work grows. So the skills in that side grow, and transactional work, the sort of drudgery to some extent, declines quite significantly. So in terms of the where we're at relative to applications, this is a kind of a snapshot, if you like, and what's been affected at the minute in quite a large way. Of about 100 companies that generate AI tools. And there's a lot of AI tools out there. And whether you're using tools at the minute, obviously 50% of you said that you were and you had adopted some tools, you're probably using something from this list. There's a lot of sales and marketing stuff out there with customer support, revenue management. There's a lot of legal firms, almost all that I've spoken to, use some form of AI within their environment. Similarly, content creation is massive within the AI space. I was just talking before we started with Russell about the fact that you have teams now that you can de-age actors actively within camera. Yeah, the director can actually see an actor at a different age, so you don't have to spend literally 6 months in post. They can do it instantly. Um, Data and analytics is huge. That's probably maybe one thing they're using within your own company. So I was actually using an analytical program yesterday, and that's available within the common suites as well, things like Google and Microsoft, etc. Chatbots are really big, and they also call to fact that there are features of AI that are important and cannot be left alone. So a lot of the government rules, I'll talk about this later, are around what can be left autonomous and what can be non-autonomous, because the government is very concerned about what is there and maybe a free agent and what is under some form of control. And it's not just about the virtual world, if you like. The physical world is adapting as well. I did a little bit of work with Wilmot Dixon a few years back, pre-pandemic, and they were already beginning to use exoskeletal systems for work, not only to protect people's backs, etc., but to enhance the strength of workers. I wouldn't mind one, actually, to be honest. But physical labor will adapt. It'll be one of the slowest, but it will adapt as changes occur. And there are some really interesting things happening in that level. So, what other examples of change are there? Well, there's changes in different roles, augmenting we've talked about. There's other things you've probably heard of prompt engineering. I'm certain you've been doing that type of thing, but even that is changing as an environment. And obviously, we're all here talking about tutoring and the learning environment. That's a key reason we're talking about it. So there's been identification. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but the government is saying that the skill level changes are most likely in levels 2 to 5, which is about nearly 300,000 apprenticeship starts. So it's a very large number of jobs affected by the AI and its environment. What they're talking about is that they are talking about this experimentation. So a lot of you already have. So if I look at the survey, 70% have some form of experimentation, if I include the adoption in there. And what they're really talking about as well is this really deep focus on what AI can't do. So when we look at ways of adapting and leading the process, that very much has to be front of mind. It's there to say, oh, we've got this shiny tool and it can do all these things. Well, yeah, that's nice. It can do all these things. And then, for example, in the paralegal world, it can help marking up stuff. However, it cannot be used in various other environments. It can't be used to manage people effectively, or it cannot have any empathetic or emotional intelligence. And actual real problem solving is still incredibly difficult. I mean, you can give AI a task, like read a document and summarize it, but to actually relate that from a human level across various elements of data is incredibly important. So it can't relate information from two summarized documents. It's very difficult to do that. So therefore, AI can be used to widen access to some extent. And good things. A Stanford report, again, which recently came out with over 10,000 people surveyed, suggested that it actually enables them to complete drudgery tasks a lot more quickly and improve their quality of output. So people, look better in their environment they're working in. They also have this ability to bridge the skill gap. Now, I think from the people on this call, that's really critical. That bridging of the skill gap to low to high skilled workers cannot be done with the tools alone. It absolutely cannot. It requires the training organizations to fill that gap to enable those skills. That clearly comes out of this report if you actually get a copy of it. And I think everyone's getting a copy of the presentation, so you see the references. There is some fear, obviously. I'm not going to go over all this slide. But it comes up all the time. The Gen AI came in the recent event in the States in New York, where people couldn't discriminate even their own children in the walkway and what they were wearing. So bias and discrimination gets accelerated as part of this this AI factor. There is a risk and there is care around that. The only thing I would say on that is if you look at the larger organizations, they're very aware of this, and they have teams that are constantly look at things like this within the market space. There are also things like environmental costs, and this is very key when you come to understand and use these tools. They use massive amounts of power to generate what they actually do, and people within organizations are more keenly aware of the environmental risks of these things. And these are things that have to be discussed. There's accidental misinformation. So one of the other things that happens within AI is the AI tools can, if you're not careful, they can share data between language models, and that language models can expose you to other cyber threats. So there's a great deal of care that has to be taken. So just a few comments here on where we're at, literally one slide. I mean, you're probably playing with some of these things. Some of you may have the Microsoft Copilot, which is probably the most integrated form, but everyone's catching up. So I downloaded the access to the latest Google Gemini application 1.5, and it's got a lot of the similar powers. So what's really interesting here is actually the models themselves are all coming to roughly the same sort of capacity. So it used to be a thing called Anthropic Claude had the biggest number of available words and effectively you could feed into it. That's no longer true. So the models themselves are kind of starting to tap off in performance. And there's one specific pointer I can put to that, which is OpenAI about a year or so back, the biggest org, mentioned a thing called ChatGPT-5. It was going to be this incredible breakthrough and semi-intelligent and some sort of AI god, etc. And Sam Altman made all these claims. They couldn't build it. They had a lot of problems with it. It wasn't this godlike machine. They couldn't train all the parameters. The models broke down. And that's why they actually ended up launching GPT-4 Omni, which just recently came out the other week, which has a lot of amazing things it can do. It has almost instantaneous language recognition, but it isn't GPT-5. And in fact, GPT-4 Omni is very close to Google Gemini and is extremely close to what Microsoft have. So there isn't a lot, there's a lot going background in terms of new fundamental changes to these models to make them do something else. So really the point of this slide is this is a good point to think beyond playing with the tools and adopting internally, but what it means to actually deploy. So other things you have to be careful of are things like the legal pitfalls of what's going on. So even models, things that you use within a single company have different terms of service, have different appointments relative to confidential data and purpose. So there is a real risk around these things. So another point, and again, this is to do with government launching things, but this is being talked about globally. So it's actually been talked about at a global level. So last week, there was a discussion around a thing called the AI Authority. So if you go back, I'm sure most of you remember the time when GDPR was introduced and you needed a data processor, you needed somebody in a larger company to say, okay, this is the way we're going to handle data. Well, there's a government proposal and it looks like it'll be driven through quite quickly, in which case you will have a thing called an AI authority oversight, which is very similar to the ICO at the minute. And that will effectively determine, it'll look at the data you process and the size of firm, but you will need an AI responsible officer, just like you have a data processor at the minute. And they will need to take care of these things, and they will need statements around what we're doing with data, what protection we put in place. So the legality of this stuff will be important. And if you're an educational type provider and in the apprentice and part of this, it's even more important. So it means that your market space will be, again, in some ways protected actually, because you'll be aware of these environments and actually have the ability to differentiate yourself if you do these things in advance. So moving on to that, one of the things that was said at a committee meeting I was at was, quite frankly, the head said, we got social media wrong. They realized they let this genie out the Pandora's box, and it led to a lot of harm. It leads to a lot of problems still, which is why I'm talking about mobile phone bans. So they're trying to contain AI within a better set of parameters, and they're trying to do it quite quickly. If you look at the EU regulations, they're very specific. If you want to launch a product in the EU, you must prove your data sources and your data training. You cannot just say, well, I'm using OpenAI and GitHub and I've designed this wonderful thing. It's not going to work. Or you can do it, but the EU is going to come after you. So we've got a slightly less of a hard touch approach. However, there is still within the national AI strategy the fact that you have to take care of GDPR, safety, secureness, transparency, fairness, etc. And as I said before, I was discussing chatbots. There's a difference between adaptive and autonomous AI. So what I mean by that, just one example, is say I'm a company and I say, right, I'm just going to have a chatbot. I'm going to base it in this AI thing and I'm going to let it run because you have very intelligent chatbot systems now. If that chatbot system ends up essentially having some degree of bias or differentiation that harms people, you will be responsible for that. So you have to be very careful that when you're stepping into that world. And as part of that, very importantly, neither Ofsted or Ofcom will inspect the tools themselves. So it's very much up to you to decide what tools you're going to use and how you adopt them. And the partners that you use have adopted a similar strategy. And so that's important in trust and importance in awards and things and the supervision. And I think where it comes down to is to saying, okay, there's all this AI out there that helps you to realize an increase in skills. However, it's it's not finished yet. And to test these skills is going to require your expertise as trainers and tutoring companies. Important to also say that they're still collating evidence, so there's work still being done. It is not complete. The sort of concerns that they have there are very much around the testing side. So bias and harm I've already talked about. I'm sure you're aware of it. You've seen those things. I've talked about adaptive and autonomous. And then there's this other thing, which is the inspector's knowledge of AI and its applications. So how does the current government group of inspectors inspect an AI adaptive environment that they're working within for apprenticeships and for schools? And that has not yet been determined. It's much been left for another thing to monitor and measure. My wife is a teacher, so I'm already aware of that and how she adapted to some of the things that we already know. And it's not easy, so I appreciate that's something that has to be moved forward. But there is opportunities because if I think of the way that I was taught when I learned certain subjects, and I'll take language as an example. So trying to learn foreign languages, it wasn't particularly something that was an easy thing to do. There are better tools to teach languages and allow language teachers to do other things. And by the way, I'll make an absolute comparison here. I use Duolingo, not an advertising thing to help. But it only gets you so far. I've realized going so far in one of the languages, I absolutely need, in fact, I moved to a trained teacher and tutor to get to the next level because the tool itself is not sufficient. And that's very true of many of the AI tools. They're really trying to adopt skill sets. So this augmentation of skills is something that I believe will help the sector quite a good deal. But it still requires the professional tutors and the professional tutoring organizations to deliver those results. This is really just an emphasis of what I said in one of the earlier slides, which is that the actual models themselves, they're improving, but they're getting to this kind of baseline type of performance. One of the big things that's changed literally in the last model releases of Gemini and also for GPT-4 Omni is actually the mathematical abilities have improved quite a bit. They weren't very good before. In fact, one way that you could determine whether you were talking to an AI or not was to give it a simple arithmetic problem, and you'll find that it couldn't do it, or the gap between the asking and getting the answer was quite long. However, the mathematical models are actually improving quite a bit now, so they're quite a good aid to training now and the new level of engagement. So what about adoption? What about how are you going to bring these AI tools to market? So these slides here around I'm going to discuss are really around the readiness and the framework for getting to market with the use of AI. So I'm going to just talk about where an example, in fact, this is an actual example presented to me by a quite largest media company who were they're basically making animation for children's programs. They said, right, we've got to adapt things. We're going to use AI. We're going to be more productive. Go to it. Go to it, engineers and designers. So they said, that's great. We get loads of tools here. They're really good. We can build cool stuff really fast. We can accelerate our workflow. Bang, production seems, hold on a second. It's not really producing as wrong, but we're going to get going. So they come up, they say, take about 9 months, and they say, okay, super, we get this AI workflow. We can do this stuff in half the time or even less. Let's go to production. Then the lawyers step in and ask, okay, what are the data sources and does the client accept those data sources? And then someone else steps in, the production team, who haven't even said this to management, are we training the software to lose our jobs? And from there, let's step back. And really, this is the process thing that's happened in a lot of cases. Is less kind of, we know the technology is there. Let's rush in. Let's try and use this thing. Let's try and get it to production. Well, actually, that's not a great way to do things. You do have to take a look at what the framework is. Now, this is one framework that I've been working on with another company, and it is only one. One of the interesting things is that the company that I work with, who deal with organizations, talk to other organizations that say we don't need more frameworks. So this is an adaptation of one that already exists. It's called Culture Web. And really what it does is it takes a kind of circular approach at how you identify and change a company's working. And what we've added in is some things around AI, really, to be honest. So we've looked at it from a top-down approach. How does the company present itself and work? Does it have a policy in AI, even to reach out to the people inside and say, we're not training people so that we can reduce jobs? Or they may say we want to remove certain jobs but move them into other ones. How does the decision-making process adapt? So in that last example I gave, the decision-making process was not well defined. They were just throwing a bunch of stuff and get on with it. So the decision-making in the application really started from the wrong place. And the organizational structure, again, wasn't set in that either, because actually everyone's running around trying to get stuff to production to release to clients. So it was not good from that point of view. And then, as I said at the end, there was no control system. Legal hadn't looked at this. There was no risk profile. There was then also, and this is really quite key, there was no reward system. So one of the big things that came out of the surveys, just going back to them for a minute, is that one of the key things that helped workers go through the process was to say, this isn't about removing work, or we may have to remove some things but train others, but we will reward the new AI augmented skills. So we will actually say, we're going to try and give you these skills and we will reward it once you understand them and you can use them. But, a big part was also collaboration and communication. And then, getting back to the views and experience. So that company I talked about took about 8 months plus to get back to the feedback to management. You really should be looking at much tighter cycles around AI and how AI is itself and skill development on it. So how do you drive those sort of things? Well, you have to drive it really from the beginning. You need a digital first type of culture, which is one of those kind of catchphrases. But really what we're saying is that if you're in an environment where the digital environment will enhance your work, then it should be something that is driving change, not just AI. And the fact that it has to be the right sort of human machine team that gets things together. Because I mentioned before, this is not about AI replacing a lot of stuff. It has to be in some sort of joint environment. Understanding what the skill set levels are, and then looking at how you measure it. So one of the things in the Mercer report was that most of the larger organizations are using AI. They want to use AI at a greater pace to measure those skills. So there's also a case of saying, if you're using AI to measure those skills, how are you delivering those enhanced skills in the first place? And how are you rewarding it as well? If you're saying they're getting those skills, what does that actually mean? So it needs commitment across all the stakeholders. You do need to give everyone responsibility for the risk awareness that's going on. But you do also need to look at fostering a risk mindset. So as far as taking risk, I think you actually said it within the poll. 50% have it, or 70% have got the tools, they're doing things with it, but they're not quite ready to step outside. And that's good. I think that's the right way to do it, as we're saying. But there is this point now that you do need to interact with other organizations, particularly organizations that have taken the journey and have had the risk internally and have seen the risk and have adapted it and know what they can actually deliver, and have spent quite a long time with those tools and know they can deliver enhanced, in this case, learning experiences or educational experiences. You do need to monitor indicators. So you do need to look at what's going to happen. But most companies of any size have a risk, ISACA-based risk person in there. So you should be, anyone that's doing the risk stuff should be reporting these things regularly and then incentivizing. It should be a large part of the risk matrix. And then rally around a few metrics. Don't have too many things to think of. So if you add AI to something, it shouldn't be, oh my God, what else have I got to do? That should not be what is happening. It really should be metrics around, this is the way we're going to develop around this. And if you can, join something outside of your own group, even perhaps outside of your own environment as it exists as an organization. If you're a training organization delivering key skills, it may be some of the things that skill endpoint is. And the legal side, there are legal AI consortiums, for example. And then you have to regularly audit the work climate and the worker habits, which goes to that cultural web that I was talking about. And also try and tie AI to the other non-AI metrics. So I discussed before, people are concerned about AI. So what does it mean for healthcare, for gender, and other factors within the workspace? So look at all these things together. This is a kind of an example I pulled. It's not one that I was involved with, but it's quite an interesting one. And it was an internal teaming. It was really enabling pharmaceutical companies to drive action within individual teams. It is much easier if you're within a big environment. This is a big company, to go away and play. It gets much harder, of course, the smaller the organization and the more pressure there are under it. However, what happens within most of these AI cases is that you do come up with some degree of Gen AI principles, at least. So I'm hoping that the 50% of you that have done the work internally have come up with some set of results that you think can be applied later on to the actual workspace and to the environment that you provide for your clients. So what about career pathways? How does it actually change training programs and that type of thing? So this is really just from the LSEP 24 report, where they actually categorized most at risk and least at risk within the environment. I think that the least at risk is easy to see when I was discussing the physical environment. You know, if you're a plasterer or somebody working in the built environment, you know, you're probably not going to be touched for a while, but it will at some point, and change your job. If you look at the most at risk factors, there are, you know, people that are already exposed. I mean, if I go back to one of my old roles, there was a number of people in that environment really were not required anymore. So I can create my own management spreadsheets, my own data analytics very easily as a singular within a small company. So there is that factor in things. But interesting enough, they put things like management consultants and business analysts at the top of the list. Means I've got to worry. But however, I don't see that as a result. Actually, what's happening is people are adapting to the tools that they have. So I use AI tools every day to summarize calls, to drive the AI analytics. It simply comes a point of saying, if somebody's using me or somebody else within a company, I expect more from that individual because they should have that AI skill set within their book, really, if you like. So all these things are required. If I take things that the legal profession, they have it in here. However, legally, there are a lot of elements to control those factors. You still have to set and pass the various exams to get to where you need to go. And this cannot be done in isolation. So again, even though the jobs are at risk to an extent, they're going to adapt. I don't think we'll see a complete disappearance because of the things that have to happen. There'll be some very, very low touch environments that will, but I think a lot of the high touch ones are going to remain and change. The career pathways will change, and it will change to adapt so that you can deliver the right skills for the augmented AI environment. So things like I was discussing a business analyst, I don't have to understand how to spin certain parts of data, but I have to understand what that data means. What does it mean for a business? What does it mean for how they might execute something? If I'm an accountant, again, I can use AI to analyze spreadsheets and other factors very, very quickly. But I still have to understand the basis and the communication between a report, how that's delivered to the government, or what taxation is required. So you don't have, AI doesn't have all the answers to that. So there's many things, but there is a case of adaptation to what's going on. So what about training programs? So it'll be acquiring skills to enable new roles to meet individual requirements, really. It'll be strategic long-term planning. I don't know, I've only talked to Aptem really on this, but when you start to design things on career pathway redesign, you have to examine people affected by if you're internally in the business or you're externally, and then you have to adapt to what's required to provide the output. Because this then is about how do you test that individual skills. You can't just test them on perhaps what they had before. You have to have new levels of test so that they've understood what's going on. A little bit of an example again is I was talking to someone whose son did his history homework in less than 5 minutes. Well, that's fine. He didn't like history and he just wanted to produce a result. But if he undergoes a test in the environment, he will fail the test. And the reality is that we have to adapt and decide how those factors occur, how those factors are tested. So there has to be leadership at every level, and there has to be skills and skills benchmarking. So I think one of the big things that trainers and training programs will provide, one of the critical things, is how do you benchmark and test these new skills? So you have to be able to decide what the level of skill is with the AI, and then how do you test and train for it? Because ultimately, AI will also look at your skill set. So AI is being used a great deal at the minute to look at CVs and other factors. So how does that amend what you're doing in the environment as well? So evaluating and testing is very much done together. It starts with the people in this call and how you're supported. The art doesn't change, just the tools. We are really just talking about tools within an environment, things that are useful, they're not people. And in fact, if you use them in the wrong way, and I've seen this before, they might magnify faults. One of the first things I tested was, automated PowerPoint systems for just throw something in and it'll give me a presentation. It doesn't really, because it doesn't really talk to what you're trying to do often. You have to adapt things. I've also seen automated training systems. You may have seen some of the AI-based ones already and thought, oh my God, is things going to disappear? I do not think that is the case, because the AI piece may be useful for, say, a small internal program, but again, it is likely that it cannot supplant all the individual skills that are required to link those skills to other jobs and to other things that you may have to do from a human point of view, which are not related to AI. So as I mentioned, there's many things there. What is going on? If you talk about just learning code. So yeah, AI can actually code things. You can sit down and it can generate code, but it doesn't understand how applications work. You cannot use AI to generate an app that is safe in any way whatsoever. You need all the wraparound and the understanding of software engineers that understand how all the pieces fit together and to make it secure. So these things need to be learned as well. So a critical pathway remains for all of this. And testing, I think, will become more rigorous. And that is where companies like yourselves will be incredibly important, whether you're within a large company or within a training organization. And I think testing in person probably becomes more frequent for key subjects. So to conclude, I think it's really just a case of saying, don't go through the looking glass alone. Companies like Aptem have spent a lot of time with their own programs and their own products, and they've done a really good job, what I can see, of providing a suite of things that are going to help on that journey. And it's important that you do reach out to get to this how. And I mentioned one thing I've been working on from a leadership point of view, but there are others. And I'm sure if you've done any sort of leadership and leadership training, then you know those sort of frameworks exist. And it also depends on the type of leadership you have within an organization. So I think one of the key things is to really define the principles of use and engagement and what outcomes are required. Oh, sorry, some noise come in there. So who's in the background? If you could mute for a second.
Apology. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if you could define those principles of use and engagement and what outcomes are required, and it really is that thing. It's not just rushing to look at these shiny new tools. If you're in a large organization, it means clarity within and between departments. If it's in an organization dealing with larger companies, you need clear parameters, the data use between the organization, the legal clearance, stuff like that. And it's really about hearts and minds and end method. So, it is shifting skill requirements. So as organizations, these employers are going to demand these new skills, and being able to provide them within an environment will be one of your key tick points. Really, it'll be something for you to deliver to the market, because you will enable those people to provide the increased productivity. Resistance is futile, but the current tools need to come from trusted pools and engaged discovery. The Gen AI LLMs are mature, but they carry risk, and test is imperative. So I think one of the other key things here is, if you're waiting for some form of deployment, some better Gen AI to come along, it isn't probably going to happen. There are big changes happening within the way they're designing them, because we've kind of reached that sort of step point from a model point of view. So really partner with trusted suppliers, and especially those that have taken the journey in part and seen some of the pitfalls, I think is key. And lastly, do remember, people kind of go on about these things, and I've seen, because I've worked in the technology world, people going, "Ooh, this is great," and yeah, it is great. It's incredibly impressive technology, but it's not human, and it isn't ever going to be. The guy that invented the first chatbot, and I'm talking about the 1950s, he was really concerned about anthropomorphism, and he said, "Always remember, this thing I've invented is just a piece of technology. That's all it is. It isn't human. It isn't ever going to become human either." So, a quote from a book that I love, you should read: "The situations are changing. You're really challenged now to change yourselves in some way." But I don't think that's a negative point. I think it's really about stepping back and thinking about the future and where you want to step into it. So anyway, with that, thank you very much. I'll hand back for questions.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. I'm sure that I'm not alone in thinking that. Genuinely, so much to pick up on. I might have to borrow your "art doesn't change, just the tools." I think that's a great phrase that I'm going to keep. So,
you can see it.
thank you. And probably, speaking from my perspective, that I would imagine is shared. I think, broadly speaking, society as a whole can see the potential opportunities and potential application of AI. But I think not just those kind of wider existential pieces that you talked through today, or application in industry, but I think the thing that I've become very much aware of is the risks around the potential creation of your kind of own AI solutions. So the implications of organizations building stuff around kind of legal pitfalls, data, AI responsible offices, the potential for AI tools kind of sharing data between LLM models. All of these things are, I guess, I've been slightly cognizant of, but I guess from Aptem's perspective, with what we're building, we're doing all that heavy lifting, right? But maybe it kind of just speaks to, if you go off and do these things on your own, or you don't choose those right partners, you're potentially opening yourselves up to more risk than you may thought of off the bat. Is that kind of a fair comment, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it comes to, I mean, I don't know what the experience was like within Aptem. I know you've been working on it for the last 2 or 3 years. If I look at that media example, it's almost exactly the same. If you're doing it internally, you need pretty skilled engineering departments to do it. But it's not just about that. You also need the process. So going back, and I'm not trying to, I mean, I should pick an Aptem or anyone, but I bet you had the
Yeah.
same experience. I bet you had the experience of going, "Oh crap, this doesn't work. What's going on there?" Like, you know, the teams would have been doing stuff, and it would have been breaking. But that point of having it internally for a couple of years, that's exactly the same thing happened in that media company. They kind of went away, did stuff. They didn't think that much about the legal or data implications, and they got tied up. They could have
Mm.
actually done a faster process if they'd adopted some sort of approach that was more structured, like I was talking about. But I think it's really important. The thing I was mentioning around the AI authority and the AI officer, those come up fairly recently, but I'm certain they're going to rush them through, from what I know, because it means that they push the onus on organizations. So, therefore, to your point, you have to be careful and you have to talk to people that have gone through the journey, I think. And then the other point in data sharing is really prescient because I read a report this morning, which means that if you look at Google and its AI and Microsoft and whatever, there are ways they allow you to share systems. Okay, they don't lock things off. Trouble is when you do that, data exposure just goes nuts. So this the exposure of data is really key in this, and where the data comes from. So I think being on the journey for a while is great. I think if you've been using it, half the people had. I don't know what the journey's been like, but I imagine they've done some experimentation. I think it is time to step outside now. I think it's time for organizations to use and adapt and to really decide. I mean, just talking about what we're talking about here and skills and apprentices and training, to decide how they will enable their customers to get those skills faster. Because the big thing from that survey I presented at the beginning is organizations want people with those AI skills and they want to drive them. So there's an opportunity there, I think, for everybody in this call.
Yes, it's a good point to make. I was just thinking about a work and skills event I went to this week around AI, and I think there was some conversation around probably the disconnect between kind of leadership teams that are ready to embrace AI and that workforce that's probably more hesitant. And I think that hesitancy can have different starting points based on your role and where you're working. But
Yeah, no, I
is there any,
agree.
yeah, do you, again, probably a slightly oversimplified picture, but is there an approach that kind of leaders and leadership teams can take to deal with maybe some internal resistance and bring colleagues along and stakeholders along on that journey with them? That probably the cultural aspect is kind of what I'm pointing to.
Yeah, no, it really is about that. It depends on the leadership style, I'll be honest as well. I mean, like,
Mm.
if you're in an organization where you've an autocratic type leadership, and I've been there, they may say, okay, we're going to do these things. Okay, I'm going to assume it's not that type of environment because most people don't want to work that way. Within that environment, you really need to explain to people what you're trying to do from a top down approach. You actually need a policy to say, we're going in this journey with AI because we're going to make these decisions in this way. Because I'll give you another example is ethics. One of the organizations I talked to last week said, there's people within the org that are concerned about not just their jobs, but am I using something that is so energy hungry it's going to eat the planet up, and there are reasons for that. So there's an ethical framework to say, okay, how are we going to deploy this? What tools are we using? What does it mean for the future of that? I think that individuals and environments are often afraid. I mentioned the media company again. People are saying, am I doing this? If I can do this 10 times faster, does it mean that you don't need me anymore, or you only need this fraction of me? But what has happened in the companies that I've seen is that the management, the good ones anyway, have said, okay, well, we're going to do this because we can enable you to do a better job with the right skills. And we're going to train you enough to mean that if you wanted to leave, you could because you have the right skills, but you enjoy it so much that you want to stay. It's an old Branson thing, to be honest, but
Yeah, and
it's true.
I
It's
guess
true. Yeah,
yeah, I was just thinking back. Obviously, mindful of time, so we'll get through a couple of questions that have
yeah.
come in. But enhancing that environment that employees working is one thing, but speaking to some of the slides early on in that presentation, it's creating more time or more opportunity to deliver a human centered approach. Focus on the relational or the qualitative aspects of your
Yeah,
work because of AI, because it's picking up on those kind of lower rung administrative or operational challenges that organisations have.
yeah.
Just a few quick questions here. Again, I know we've got 5 minutes, but just uh, you spoke about that kind of being that member of the kind of AI all-party parliamentary group, and
Mhm.
what kind of things are currently being discussed at the moment in that form that might be of interest to us in this webinar?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it is what we talked about. It's really about data sharing. There is they do feel that there's a kind of a duty of care,
Mm.
whatever the color of the government moving forward. Everyone, it's a multi-party thing, so everyone
Yeah.
agrees the same. They do want to see everyone being enabled and stepped up. So this the Ofsted Ofport stuff. They know it's making a big impact. They're trying to drive through change quite quickly. They're trying to give people the tools to do that. And
Mm.
I think there is a genuine thought that we can be a leader. Now we don't have the silicon, we don't have Microsoft or whatever. However, we have some good. We have Synthesia, we have people like DeepMind. We have a lot of stuff that's come out of this country from both the university and other environment that means that we can be a leader and a thought leader as well. So we want to be leading the environment. So one of the key things, just one small point, is we don't want to be quite as onerous as the EU. So the EU is pretty strict on a lot of stuff. So we're trying to just not dial it down a bit, but allow a little bit more freedom in terms of what can be done. And they're trying to balance that freedom with risk. Basically, is the big thing that's discussed a lot. Most of that risk comes from data exposure, which is why I talked about the AI, responsible officer thing.
Gotcha. So, what do you think is the biggest misconception around AI adoption, and what would your message be, given all of your experience?
What's the biggest message? That's an interesting one. That. I mean, I think that it is going to. I do not think it will replace many jobs. I think it will change a lot. So I think the job fair is not as big as it should be in the environment. I think people still need those skill sets. I've not seen. There's a lot of open recs around for various things. I think people are
Mm.
looking for it. So I think AI adoption will not replace people as fast as people think. That's probably the biggest thing.
Okay, thank you. And do you think there are any blind spots that you think people aren't giving adequate consideration to when, I suppose, bringing AI into their organisations? What are we not thinking about?
I think it goes back to the point earlier. I think it's assuming that it can bring change really quickly. So you have to plan that change. You really shouldn't just throw a bunch of tools at people, like I was mentioning before, because that's not planned change. That's just people playing around. So it really is about stepping back and everybody stepping back, particularly management within any
Mm.
company of any size. And that includes just me within a small company thinking, what do I need from AI? What do I need to use it for? Why? So
Yeah,
that's,
thank you, Rob. And I suppose, I mean, just to use I guess, an Aptem example is that, we've spent some time considering what those problem statements that still exist within this sector and how
yeah.
we might go about addressing that with kind of AI and these large language models in time alongside kind of our customer base
Mhm.
and the sector more broadly, in order that it's probably somewhat more thought through than just kind of picking up a series of tools and maybe a bit more of a scattergun approach. Is that kind of what you're saying? It needs to be
Yeah,
more
no,
thought through.
that's right. Yeah. And really
Okay.
thinking about you had a specific set of outcomes you wanted to drive. Therefore,
Yeah.
you drove the environment to those outcomes. It wasn't about it's a bunch of AI stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the key thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you. So I know we're just coming to time, and it genuinely has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed today. So thank you so much for putting all this work in, Rob, and presenting a picture for us.
Okay. Thanks very
Lots
much.
to think about as we progress with our AI journey, on our own or collectively as a sector or societally. So look, just a reminder to everybody that's on the session today, we'll be sending the recording by email, but we'll also put it on our website as well. So just look out for that in the next couple of days, and also just look out for the invitation to our next Aptem product roadmap update, which will share, essentially the next iteration of our AI-driven Aptem enhanced features. So thanks everybody for attending. It's been fantastic. Appreciate the questions. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll be in touch soon. Take care, and thanks again, Rob.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.